Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Radical Reptiles. My name is Dan Marina. I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Long Point Basin Land Trust. And I'll be doing a quick introduction and moderating the question period. But before we get going, and while people are still signing in, a couple of quick housekeeping items. This is the second webinar of the fourth Explore the Outdoors event for 2022. If you haven't already, I encourage everyone to check out the events page of our website to see all the other events we have lined up for this year. So please spread the word as well. We like to get a lot of people engaged and involved in this program. As well, I want to point out that tonight's event is proudly sponsored by Ruffin's Pet Centers. So a special thank you to Ruffin's for supporting tonight's program. And very briefly, Long Point Basin Land Trust is a charitable non-government organization with the mission to protect and restore functioning ecosystems in the Long Point Basin, a geographic area located in the Central Carolinian region. This is achieved through land securement, habitat restoration, research, and outreach. We also encourage everyone to visit our website, to sign up to our e-newsletter, and join us on social media to learn about all the exciting things we have happening at the moment. Long Point Basin Land Trust currently owns and stewards 341 hectares over 13 nature reserves. All of them are located within Norfolk County. 7 of the nature reserves are open to the public and have, or we are currently in the process of developing, a formal trail system. So we're wanting to provide opportunities for people to connect with the environment through hands-on and outdoor experiences. So some of the upcoming events we have, this Friday we have a garlic mustard pulling event, which is a volunteer work day. So that'll be at the Shirley and George Pond Nature Reserve from 1 to 3 p.m. this Friday. So if anyone wants to come help us do some invasive species removals, that would be great. All hands on deck there. And our next Explore the Outdoors event is Saturday, June 11th. That's from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And that'll be a nature photography hike. And so with us today, we have Cheryl Sheridan, and she's going to be talking to us about reptiles. Cheryl has a background in zookeeping, wildlife rehabilitation, and veterinary care. Cheryl worked with everything from farm animals to coyotes, birds of prey to sloths. But from a young age, the group that fascinated Cheryl the most were reptiles. Cheryl's career and passion have sent her across the world in search of reptiles, but some of the best reptiles are right here actually in Canada. And nowadays, Cheryl coordinates conservation-themed live animal exhibits at zoos and museums throughout North America. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it over to Cheryl to take us forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for having me. I'm going to do the same thing here, share my screen so that hopefully we can follow along. All right, so thank you so much again for joining and having a passion to learn about the things that I'm the most passionate about, our reptile species here in Canada, especially right here in our own backyard in Ontario. And so, yeah, this is actually my first formative experience with reptiles, the first memory that I ever have. This is me a couple years old at the cottage with a little tiny smooth green snake. So people do often ask me if I have any fear of working with some of these animals, and nope, clearly from a very young age, I had no fear, just fascination. And I'm hoping if there is anybody here that is maybe here to learn a bit more about them, that I can spread some of that passion to you guys too, and help alleviate any potential fears or concerns that you might have about sharing your backyards and your nature centers with these amazing animals. Now, again, Ontario, we are very lucky here, at least I consider us lucky. Again, sometimes people do have a little bit of fear or apprehension about these animals. And so the idea that we have the most diverse province for reptiles in Canada might sound a little bit intimidating to some people. But again, we do here in Ontario, we have 8 species of turtle, 16 species of snakes, and 1 species of lizard. And one thing about this group of reptiles is almost all of our species that we have here are actually species at risk. Something to do with their habitat or the different threats that they face make it difficult for them to have sustainable populations here in Ontario. So we'll get to meet a few of these different individuals as we go along through the presentation and learn about some of those things and maybe even what you can do to help the animals as well. Now, identifying these different animals, that's probably one reason why you might have come to see this webinar today, to actually be able to tell one species from another. And just to kind of get rolling with this, we have this really beautiful animal, very bright colors, nice orange with these obvious darker blotches down its back surrounded by black. We have another animal here with a very pale color, those very obvious red eyes. This snake has these beautiful stripes running down its back instead of the blotchy pattern we saw earlier. And then this fellow looks like he can camouflage very well, has a much more neutral colored background. The thing is about all four of these snakes in particular is they're actually all the exact same species of snake. This is a corn snake, which is a species that is very commonly kept as a pet. They're found throughout Eastern North America, mostly in the US, but we do have some of their relatives that live here in Ontario as well. And the main point that I'm trying to make here is just that it is actually really difficult to be able to easily identify one species from another, because the individual animals tend to be very diverse in their colors and their patterns. So it can be really tricky to be able to make it really easy to figure out who's who. Not only that, but in an individual animal, there's also often very dramatic changes over time. So on the left-hand side, we see a little baby northern water snake, one of our native species here, and it has a blotchy pattern with these dark blotches on top of a much lighter background versus the fully grown adult version of the same snake, which is very dark to the point where we can barely even see those blotches anymore. And even looking at things like the face shape looks quite a bit different. So to think that those are the exact same species of snake can be a little bit tricky. So snake identification is really challenging. Now, probably though, the most important snake that everyone wants to know how to be able to identify safely is our only venomous snake that we have here in Ontario. And we do have a venomous snake. It's our Massasauga rattlesnake. Massasauga, not Mississauga. And that's the fellow there. And so again, you see sort of this blotchy pattern. You can sort of try and absorb in what that snake looks like. The only problem is that most of our other Ontario species of snake actually look quite similar. We have a lot of snakes that have this light pale background color with the darker blotches that run down its body. Not only that, but one thing that you might think of to identify a rattlesnake is, of course, the rattle itself. But surprisingly, all of these other snakes that are pictured here on this slide will also rattle their tail in defense. They don't have a real rattle the same way that the rattlesnake itself does. They don't have that hardened piece of skin at the very end of their tail that they can shake back and forth, but they're actually surprisingly good at making you think that they do. They can shake their tail very fast, and especially when it's hitting against some dry leaves or some bark or some twigs, it sounds very convincing like a rattle. And not only that, but to protect themselves, these snakes will sometimes huff and puff and do something called a mock strike to look big and scary, because ultimately they're not all that big and scary if you really know what they're all about. So their job is to make you think that they are, to make you think that they're threatening and dangerous, so that you back off and you leave them alone. So these are a couple of our native species, again, all which have some similar traits to our rattlesnake. We do have our beautiful fox snake up here in the top left, and then you might notice a couple different looking baby snakes here on the top right. Those are actually some gray rat snakes that were born in a zoo, and you can actually see the one has the very pale color, is actually albino, which is a trait that can sometimes occur sometimes in wild snakes as well as often with snakes in human care versus the wild type, as we call them, that's there as well. That's a more gray color. And then we also have our eastern milk snake and a young baby water snake as well. And then another species, the hognose snake, is especially known to look quite a bit and act quite a bit like a rattlesnake in its defensive reactions. So one way that we can try and determine whether the snake we just ran into is a rattlesnake or another species is looking at where you actually ran into that animal. And so there is a little map here of Ontario, and the area in red is the area where the Massasauga is currently considered to be found, and the yellow area is where they were found historically. But we're talking, unfortunately, at this point, close to half a century or more ago that they were found in those areas where the yellow is. So there's basically 3 different populations. The main population where the rattlesnake is doing the best is up in around Georgian Bay on the Bruce Peninsula and in the Muskoka area. But you'll also notice that there's 2 very, very small populations, a Wainfleet Bog, which is in the Niagara region, and then all the way down at the other end of Ontario there at the far west, we have the Ojibwe Prairie Complex, and that's close to Windsor and Sarnia. And unfortunately, the last wild rattlesnake that was found in the Ojibwe Prairie Complex was in 2018. So there hasn't been a wild snake seen since then, a wild rattlesnake. And it is a question that comes up quite a lot when we talk about conservation of species, especially talking about conservation of snakes, is why would we want to bother saving a rattlesnake anyways? They're venomous, aren't they dangerous? But of course, all species are equally important. They have their own spot in that ecosystem, being prey, being predators, and they have a lot to teach us as well. These animals will also eat different animals that are in the environment that can be pests to us. And we're constantly learning new things about the venom themselves, using that in our own human medication and making some amazing strides. Different types of snake venom have been used in medication for diabetes, medication for stroke, for different blood disorders, all sorts of absolutely incredible things that we might never have discovered without the use of that venom. So it holds a lot of treasure for us. Now, kind of going back again, how can we identify this snake? It is, again, probably one of the more important species to be able to identify from the other snake species that we have in Ontario. And there are a couple key features that when you pile them all together as a whole can hopefully help you determine this species versus another type of Ontario snake. Again, we do have the pale background with the darker blotches, which again is a very common feature we see in many Ontario species of snake. But we do have a couple other defined features. We have those cat-shaped or elliptical vertical pupils, which most other snakes are going to have rounded pupils. And then we have the nostril, but also a secondary hole in the face that are the heat pits. So snakes have some pretty amazing senses. One of the major senses that they use to explore the world around them is going to be their tongue, which facilitates something very similar to a sense of smell. And this is a amazing sense for them. They are thought to be able to smell quite a bit better than even something like a dog can smell. So it's really how they explore their world around them. Their eyesight is definitely not as good as ours. However, especially certain snakes like pythons and vipers, which the rattlesnake belongs to the viper group, they also have that ability to sense and feel heat. Now, of course, we all can feel heat too. If we sit out in the sun, we'll feel that warmth radiating in. If we touch something hot or cold, we can obviously feel the difference in between that. But these snakes are incredibly sensitive to differences in temperature, enough that they can sense it from a distance and be able to actually feel the difference between a small rodent walking through the environment that might be a food item for them and the surrounding air, and the difference in temperature in between that, up to about 0.02 degrees Celsius differences in temperature. So it's a pretty miraculous sense that really lets them be effective predators. So that is a fairly unique thing. Certainly here in Ontario, they're the only snake that has that heat pit. However, you have to get pretty close to the animal to actually see that heat pit, which isn't something you might want to do with a rattlesnake. Of course, then there's also the rattle itself. One of the best ways to tell the difference between the rattlesnake rattle and a harmless snake mimicking a rattle would be the actual position. Rattlesnakes like to hold their tail up in the air and shake it back and forth to make that characteristic noise, where if a non-venomous snake does that, it won't make any noise, so they do have to buzz it directly against the ground. These are pretty cryptic species. Here he is again, just to get a feel. We can take a look at those features again. If you look closely, you can definitely see that elliptical pupil, and you can see the heat pit. So that big hole that at first you might have thought was a nostril is actually the heat pit, and the nostril is a much, much smaller feature up closer to the center of the snout. It just looks like a little slit. And so you can see a couple of those features there on this guy. Now, a lot of times these animals do rely on their ability to blend into the environment. They're very cryptic. And a big thing about these snakes and helping you identify them from other species is how small they are. At about maximum size, a Massasauga rattlesnake will very rarely get over 2 feet long, and about 2/3 of a meter. And so being that small, a lot of our other Ontario snakes that are often mistaken for rattlesnakes often get a lot larger, things like our water snakes, our fox snakes, our gray rat snakes. So if you are seeing a snake that is 5-6 feet long, that's definitely not a rattlesnake. So again, they're very, very short in comparison. They have kind of a chunky, squat body frame. And most of what they want to do is to hide, stay out of sight, because our foot is more than a match for them. We can very easily hurt them. That's not what they want to have happen. We're not their food, so there's not really a good reason to bite us unnecessarily. When that rattle comes into play is when the rattlesnake feels like it has no other choice. The rattlesnake serves as, the rattle itself serves as a warning to hopefully get us to back off and leave that animal alone. So typically, if we were to happen to be, say, walking in an area where this snake lives, and we happen to get a little bit too close, that's when it might rattle. If we're several feet away, it might stay very quiet, very cryptic, hope that we're just going to walk past and not see it. But if we get a little too close, that's when that rattle might happen. And if you are in that situation where you would hear a rattle, the best thing to do is to stop and locate where that sound is coming from. The rattlesnake is not going to come after you, chase you. It is going to stay still, or in the best case scenario, it might even try and move away if it sees an opportunity to do so, but it's not going to come after you. So it's better to stay still, to find out which direction, where that animal actually is, and then slowly, calmly move in the opposite direction. If you are in one of those regions that rattlesnakes live, it is important to make sure that you wear proper footwear and you keep dogs on a leash. Unfortunately, that is usually the number one victim of our Massasauga rattlesnake, is not people, but dogs, because they're very curious animals and they explore things with their nose. So if they get up in the face of a rattlesnake, a lot of times that rattlesnake won't necessarily react, won't necessarily bite, but obviously if they're under severe threat, they might. So definitely in those areas where the rattlesnakes live, it is safer to keep your dog on a leash to make sure they stay safe from that. But even in the case of a dog getting bit, they can still be saved. Just before we get into what would happen in a bite scenario, here's another little photo of a baby Massasauga rattlesnake, just showing you that rattle. We actually call that a button. When the baby rattlesnake is born, they don't come equipped with a full entire rattle. Instead, they only have that one little piece, the button. And every time they shed, they gain a new piece on top of the rattle. After they get a couple, they will be able to shake it side to side and make that noise, that warning noise. But it is kind of cute seeing a baby rattlesnake try and rattle and it doesn't make any noise at all. It's silent. There is a common myth that you can tell how old the rattlesnake is based on how many segments is on their tail. Unfortunately, there's no set period of time in between each shed and when they would gain a new segment. It's more related to how much food they have the opportunity to eat. And on top of that, they can also damage that rattle. It is very common if they go through multiple sheds, especially in a wild snake, they're likely going to be crawling through their environment and the rattle's going to get snagged and pieces are going to fall off. So it's not really a good indicator of how old the animal might be. So of course, probably the most interesting / potentially scary thing about a rattlesnake here in Ontario, in our cottage country where we might be spending our time, is what happens if you actually get bitten. And luckily, there aren't very many bites depending on the year. We typically have in between 0 to 10 bites in a year throughout all of Ontario. There's only been 2 fatalities since the 1960s. In both cases, those were cases where there was no hospital care at all. And so it is something that is quite treatable and typically survivable even without medical treatment, but it is still a medical emergency. We definitely would never recommend not to seek hospital care. Certainly it can cause damage because of the impacts of the venom. But again, bites overall are very rare. When we dive into the statistics, the majority of people that are bitten aren't bitten when they're just going on hikes or enjoying their time in the natural space. Most people are bitten when they actively engage with the snake, either attempting to kill it or move it, or sometimes to essentially play with it, pick it up and hold it. So obviously it is best to give these animals space, leave them alone, respect them. Certainly, we wouldn't want to pick up a snake if we're not sure what species it is. And a lot of our snake species are also protected as well from being handled and manipulated. So it is much better to leave them alone. Now that's just one snake out of 16 species that we have here in Ontario. The next snake here, the garter snake, that is probably one that everybody has seen multiple times in their life anywhere through Ontario. These guys are very charismatic. They're out and about during the daytime. They're nice and obvious with those big yellow stripes that run down their body, and that is the garter snake. The name comes from the stripes that run down their body. They sometimes get called gardener snakes or garden snakes, which is a name that seems to make sense because you will definitely find them in the garden, and they are a gardener's friend. These snakes will eat a variety of different types of prey. They're not very picky at all, but some of their favorites include things like snails and slugs, which can cause damage to a garden. So they're definitely a nice species to have around. Again, they're just able to hang out and live in just about any and all habitat in southern Ontario. They do love to be in and around water and to swim, but they'll be found in different forested regions and meadows and really everywhere and anywhere that you would find snakes. They're one of the few species that is not considered to be a threatened species just because of how amazingly adaptable they are. They are a species too that we often see right in the middle of the city, anywhere where there's a little park or a stream. Sometimes even just in your backyard, you might see these snakes. And again, they're another example of why snakes can be a little bit tricky to identify. They have this typical characteristic stripe pattern that runs all the way down their body, except when they don't. Up here on the top right, there's this very dark colored individual, which is a melanistic phase, which is a phase that we often see around the shores of Lake Erie. So it's just a genetic mutation and adaptation potentially in the future. That dark color does have its advantages that we'll see later. But again, this is a species that we typically run into quite often and is nice and easy to observe. You don't have to look too hard or too far to find these guys. And then our other most common species are some of our smallest species. So we have starting here on the top left, our brown snake, top right, our ringneck snake, and then down here on the bottom showing off the colorful belly that gives it its name, the red-bellied snake. So these are all incredibly tiny, tiny snakes. The one being held at the bottom, that is a fully grown adult snake. So they stay very, very small. The red belly and the ringneck, they have very sort of cryptic, muted, well camouflaged colors on the top of their body, but then they have this very bold color, and the color might vary depending on the individual. It ranges from a fairly bright red to an orange all the way to a yellow coloration depending on the individual. And so that bright color, it helps to protect these animals. It's used in their defensive strategy. Most of the time, they try and stay out of sight, and they'll often be found under leaf litter or other artificial cover. Most of the time when we bump into them, it could be when they're cruising around looking for food, but it might also be when we're doing some backyard cleanup in our yards and we flip something over that's maybe been sitting in the backyard for a couple months, and we might see one of these guys sitting underneath it. They really like that artificial cover to protect them. And it's also a spot where some of their favorite food live. Since these guys are very small, most of what they're eating are things like earthworms and slugs and snails. That makes up most of their food. And so again, that cryptic coloration, just sort of a dull neutral color, helps them to blend in, makes them hard to find. But being so small means that just about every and any other sort of predator will happily munch on these guys. And so they do have that really bright coloration on the underside. And often if they're disturbed and they're really threatened, they'll make a sort of corkscrew type shape with the bottom half of their body, usually the tail region, because of course, if you have a long body with all your head and your organs in that area, the spot that's the least important to your survival is your tail. So they'll often use that bright color to draw attention to the tail area. So that way, if a predator attacks, they have the chance of potentially getting away if the tail is bitten first. In fact, these guys will often struggle if they are seized by the tail, and the tail can sometimes come off. It's fairly traumatic, but it is better than potentially losing your life. So they sort of have that strategy. Now, the brown snakes and the red-bellied snakes can be fairly tricky to tell from each other. Their top surface, their dorsal surface, tends to look very, very similar in between the two species, but the big difference again will be that belly color. Our brown snakes just typically have a very neutral colored belly, as well as the top, usually just sort of a beige color, where of course those red bellies, like the name says, are going to have a much brighter belly. And then the ring neck looks very obvious to tell in comparison because of that very classic ring around the just beneath the head. Now, we do have quite a few other species found in Ontario as well, and there's some of them here, some of our larger species. So we have our eastern milk snake, and then two of our rat snakes, the gray rat snake, which if you've heard of them before, you might have also heard of them referenced as a black rat snake. There's a couple very similar species found throughout eastern North America. And then our other rat snake, which is the fox snake, which is this nice orange and yellow species. These snakes can get a little bit bigger. The gray rat snake is the largest species in Canada. It can get a hefty 8 feet long, so just a little under 3 meters. And that, again, it's our biggest snake in all of Canada as far as length goes. But when you put it in perspective and think about it, it's not really that big in the scheme of snakes worldwide. You'll notice we don't have any big pythons, any big boas, or any of those super large snakes. And there is probably a pretty good reason why that is the case that we'll get to a little bit later on. But these are some of our rodent eaters. So that's their favorite food. They will be eating a variety of small to medium-sized rodents. So they do help to contain and help with those populations. One of the benefits, other than just rodent control itself, is also some of the diseases that rodents can carry. One of the most notable ones is things like Lyme disease. Often the ticks that carry Lyme disease will feed on different types of rodents, which is one of the vectors that spreads that through our areas, especially the most southern parts of the country. And friends like these snakes can help to manage those populations and keep them down. There's actually been a number of scientific studies that show areas with strong snake populations have a much lower chance of Lyme disease. So that's just one important reason why we want to conserve the snakes in our area. Now, this guy on the far left, the milk snake, again, they like to eat a lot of rodents. The name milk snake, we believe, came about because in many eons ago, it was thought that they would actually steal the milk from cattle on farm. And it turns out that again, there's a good food source for these animals on farms, and that would, of course, be rodents. They would be eating the mice and rats. So instead of stealing from the farmers, they were actually helping out. But again, these animals can be a little bit scary and intimidating if you run into them just out of the blue. But that is just their defense. If they do put up a little bit of a show, sometimes potentially holding their ground, maybe hissing, maybe even doing something called a mock strike. Those are all ways that they try and protect themselves. And again, it's not that they want to come over, chase you, or bite you. It'd be pretty silly on their part. It's not a very good survival strategy to come and bite a giant animal that they cannot eat, and that can very easily overpower and hurt them. So their job's to look scary and intimidating so that hopefully we back off and leave them alone. But a lot of times snakes are cryptic and we don't see many of the ones that are around. And if we do see them, it's often for just a brief moment as they slither off under cover and away from us, because that is their main goal, is to keep themselves safe. And that usually means keeping their distance from us. And a couple other species here. We do have a water snake. We actually have two species of water snakes here in Ontario, our northern water snake, as well as the Lake Erie water snake. Pretty similar looking in appearance and their natural history and habits. This guy is wedged himself nice and tight in between some rocks. And again, we typically aren't going to be seeing near as many snakes as we would see things like say birds or other type of wildlife. And that's because these animals are typically very, very cryptic, and they spend a lot of their time hiding and under different types of cover, or in this case, he's got himself nice and tight in between some rocks. Makes it very difficult for any predator to come along and try and remove him and eat him. So it's a nice safe place for him to be. And then here in the middle, we have one of my favorite snakes. That's the same species that I was holding as a child in that original photo, our beautiful smooth green snake. And they are one of the only insect-eating snakes out of our species here in Ontario. Even the smallest species are typically going to be eating different types of slugs or worms, but this guy will happily munch on actual bugs as well. Different things like crickets and other things that they might encounter. And then we have a snake that looks very similar to that charismatic garter snake, but we call this individual a ribbon snake. And there is actually differences in where the stripes are located on the body in comparison to our garter snake. But one of the easiest ways to tell them apart from the garter snake is that they have a very small white mark right directly in front of their eye, which distinguishes them from our more common garter snake. Now, we've been talking a lot about snakes so far. Of course, we do also have our turtles. And just like knowing how to identify a rattlesnake in comparison to our other harmless species is probably up high on everyone's list, so is probably being able to identify our common snapping turtle in comparison to our other species of turtle. Although all turtle species can defend themselves by biting, this guy, it's right in his name. They have quite the reputation for protecting themselves in this way. And there is a really, really important reason why. Up here on the top, we have a baby common snapping turtle. At this point, they are a pretty easy snack that an animal like a bird can just simply swallow up whole. There's not really much stopping them from doing that. And as babies, if you do encounter them in this stage, they're incredibly reluctant to bite, probably because they know it's not going to be very effective. So they usually try and just sit very, very quietly, very still, try and pull themselves inside their shell. Except if we look at the second picture on the top, which shows the underside of the shell, we get a little bit of a clue as to why these animals would potentially use snapping as their main defense. And that's because they can't really fit inside their shell. They have a really, really tiny bottom area to the shell. We call that the plastron. And so they're not able to fully tuck their head, their tail, or their legs inside their shell. So that means throughout all the different stages of their life, they are pretty prone to predation. They can't utilize their shell in the same way that many other turtle species can. So if you do encounter a wild snapping turtle while it's in the water, like this guy down on the bottom right, you'll notice that They can be quite calm, quite curious about what's going on, but a lot of times they'll just quickly withdraw and disappear into the muck and the reeds, and that's about all you see from them, unless they get used to people being around, such as expecting to maybe get a fishy treat around areas where people do a lot of fishing. They are quite smart, and they will figure out those different areas and tend to hang around them. But typically, the snapping turtle is very calm when it's in the water. Even if people are swimming or doing other water activities, they happen to bump into one or even step right on top of one, it is extremely rare for them to try and bite while in the water. And that's just because the water is their element. They feel comfortable. They're great swimmers. They can quite easily swim away, and that's just a easier defensive tactic for them. However, if they're caught out on land, like this last guy here on the bottom right, that's a bit of a different story. They can't tuck inside their shell very effectively. They're not very fast, especially the larger and larger they get. They are our largest species here in Ontario, and they are one of the largest in all of North America, second only to the alligator snapping turtle down in the US. But again, they can potentially get a hefty 40 to 50 pounds. So that's a big, big turtle. That's a lot of shell and weight to carry around. So they're not particularly speedy. And so this can make them quite vulnerable to predators. At least it would if they didn't have that very strong defensive tactic, that very strong, sharp beak, and a very long, flexible neck. Anybody that's run into one of these turtles in the wild can probably say firsthand, they do tend to be quite defensive, to make sure that you stay back and stay away from them the best that they can manage. And that can potentially be a problem, because typically when we do see them out and about, it's almost always nesting females. The males are a lot less likely to leave the water, and the females typically stay there too, unless they have a really good reason to leave. And that would be to lay their eggs, because unfortunately they can't lay them in the water. They do have to come up on land and find a suitable nesting site where those eggs are going to have the best chance of success to hatch. And so they do put themselves at risk of getting hit by cars, just because of all the roadways that we have throughout the various areas of their habitat, especially the prime habitat for these turtles. And some of the prime nesting areas is things like the sides of road. That's the perfect texture, nice, easily drained, high grounded gravel is a place that they often find ideal to lay their eggs. And so that puts both the mothers at risk as well as the offspring too when they eventually hatch. Now, again, we do have some turtle diversity here in Ontario. We have some other species found here as well. We have our Blandings turtle, which this is a young individual up here on the top left. So they're often referred to as looking like a giant army helmet, and with their big, big yellow grin. So this little individual here hasn't quite got that full color in, but as they get older, that chin gets nice and yellow. And then on the top right, we have what we call a stink pot turtle or a musk turtle, which kind of looks very similar to a snapping turtle. However, they are incredibly tiny. They typically only get about 4 to 5 inches long at adult size. And they get their name for a good reason. That has that smell theme to it, stink pot and musk. And that is because when they are highly disturbed, they do have the ability to give a nice musky odor. They can actually sort of make a secretion on either side of their shell. And snapping turtles are actually known to do this too, but we usually don't see that quite as much with them as we do with these guys. And then we have the very adorable little spotted turtle down on the bottom left, another very, very small species. And both the stink pot and the spotted turtle, fortunately, they don't have as much road mortality as some of our other species of turtle, mostly because they don't tend to travel very far from their habitats. Unfortunately, they are both small and both cute, so that does make them a little bit more of a target for the pet trade, and potentially for even smuggling as well. So potentially not just that somebody may be stumbling across one and deciding to bring one home as a pet, but potentially even being shipped abroad to other countries just because of how desirable they are as this small and very cute little species of turtle. And then on the bottom right, we have one of our most at-risk species. It's a wood turtle, and they are actually more of a terrestrial species, although they still do use water to mate and to breed. They spend a lot of their time out of the water, which is where they forage for different types of prey. They happily eat different types of vegetation and different types of insects. They're very famous for their little rain dances, where they'll stomp on the ground to mimic rainfall, which has even been known to encourage things like worms to come up to the surface, where they can happily get a little tasty worm snack, which is some of their favorite food. And of course, they get the name of the wood turtle because of the shell itself, which looks like wood, like it's been carved out of wood. So very, very beautiful turtles. And unfortunately, all the species here on this slide are all at risk. Now, unfortunately, there's another species of turtle that we do often find here in Ontario, but it's unfortunately not supposed to be here, and that is the red-eared slider. You might have seen these guys before, know somebody who has them as a pet, maybe have even had one yourself as a pet at some point in time. They're very common in just about all pet stores and fish aquarium hobby stores. The little baby one on the top left is actually in its native habitat down in Louisiana, and these turtles are native to the Southeast United States, but they are incredibly hardy, adaptable turtles, and they have made their way to every continent that houses reptiles. And I myself have had the unfortunate sightings of these guys in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa as well, in areas where they are invasive. And although they are native to North America, they're not natural to Canada, but unfortunately they are found here, both here in Ontario and in other provinces as well, almost always as release pets. So often these turtles are purchased as babies. They are quite small at the time, not too much larger than a toonie. And although they are very charismatic, very amazing, amazing animals, they are also an incredible amount of work, a lot more than most people would expect from a pet. Partially because they actually get quite large. They get a shell length of about 12 inches long as a fully grown adult female, for example, which is a fairly large turtle, which requires a fairly large habitat. And they are also fairly messy as well. So without a major investment in a large habitat with an expensive filtration system, it is an incredible amount of work to maintain the water quality. On top of that, they have incredibly long lives. They can live up to about 50 years, which is a much larger commitment than most people are willing to give to a pet, especially one that might have been purchased quite cheaply when kids were young, and they lose interest potentially over time. And unfortunately, just because of how available these turtles are and how many there are out there in the pet trade in all areas of the world, they are often surrendered commonly to zoo facilities, to pet stores, to humane societies, and these facilities just get overwhelmed. I used to get about 12 emails per week or phone calls per week of different individuals wanting to donate just the red-eared slider itself. And that's not including any other species of animals that we would often get phone calls about at our zoological facility. And so it's very hard to be able to provide adequate homes for these animals that live so long and aren't particularly social. So unfortunately, sometimes in those cases, people might turn to releasing them into our waters. And of course, this is always done with the best intention. It seems like a pretty happy ending for these turtles to be able to be wild and free. And surprisingly, they, even in a place like Canada with our long cold winters, our red-eared sliders are able to survive here quite well. And the problem is what happens with the rest of our turtle species. Again, the red-eared slider is fairly large, it's fairly resourceful and aggressive, and it can often take habitat and resource away from our other turtle species that are native to these areas, especially when a lot of our species are already at risk and facing different pressures in their environment. To have the slider as another threat towards them just sort of adds to the pile and makes it that much more difficult for these animals to be able to survive. So it is really, really important to spread the word about red-eared sliders. If people are looking to get pet turtles, making sure that they do their research and making sure in most cases, if they can actually speak to a rescue and adopt a turtle instead of buying a new one from a pet store. There's a lot of amazing organizations like the Little Rescue up in the sort of Simcoe region that have done some wonderful work providing homes for these animals. And but yeah, it's a very big threat that some of our native species face. And of course, we can't forget about our only lizard species that we do have here in Ontario. I know when I first discovered that there was a lizard native to Ontario, I found it quite amazing. It doesn't really feel like a place where you would find a lizard, but yet we do have one. So this is our Fiveline Skink, and they are most known in their juvenile state, where they are just this beautiful jet black lizard with golden lines down its body and this bright, vibrant blue tail. And skinks, like many species of geckos, can also drop their tail under threat. So again, having a super brightly colored tail, if they are approached or threatened by a predator, it provides a point for the predator to potentially attack, and they're able to swiftly and easily drop their tail, and the tail will even continue to wiggle after they've let it go, giving that lizard the chance to escape and regenerate their tail in the future. So the adult female skinks, they look fairly similar. They just get a bit more faded, not quite as vibrant as those beautiful, beautiful babies, but they still carry most of those same colors and that slightly blue tail as they get older. Up here on the top left, we have what the males look like. So they lose a lot of that brighter coloration and they get a more red face and a much more brown coloration, but that is an adult male. So you can see they are quite a small species. They don't get very large at all. And this last juvenile down here at the bottom, again, you can kind of get a perspective of their size based on the size of the fingers there. And you might actually notice, if you look really closely, there's some orange specks right underneath his in his armpit there. And those are actually some parasites. Those are some mites. And the mites like to sit in those tiny little crevices in the different armpits and feed. And we do often see different sorts of ticks and leeches and other sorts of parasites on these animals in the wild, as well as things like scarring too. The wild is a hard place, and we'll often see encounters that these animals have potentially had with predators or other threats. So reptiles are fairly easy to run into. Sometimes we don't necessarily see the reptile itself all the time. We might see a shed skin from a snake. We might see the evidence of a nest like what we have here on the left-hand side, a turtle nest that has emerged. Sometimes they get eaten by predators, and sometimes they have the opportunity to actually grow and hatch. And probably the reptiles that we see more often than any other species are turtles, because they will sit out a little bit more open, especially this beautiful painted turtle sitting here in this environment as you're wandering around, especially calmer waters, looking out where there might be exposed rocks or logs, are places where some of these turtle species will like to pull themselves up and sun themselves. They're a great opportunity, especially if you have a nice camera, to be able to take some really pretty photos of these animals. So sometimes we might be looking for them. At least that's one of my hobbies, is to actually, when I'm on nature walks and the like, I love seeing these animals in their native habitats. Sometimes it might be a little bit more on the apprehensive side. We're wondering how not to see reptiles. Again, I would definitely encourage that reptiles are definitely our friends and very, very beneficial. They do a lot of beneficial things for our ecosystem. So they're animals that we want to have around. But if you are a little bit concerned about having reptiles in your area, especially something like a snake, making sure that backyards are clutter-free is probably one of the best ways that you can discourage a snake from deciding that that is their home. Snakes like nice warm places to hide, so they do like, say, piles of wood or other sort of debris that might be in a backyard might be a safe spot for them to find themselves. So keeping yards sort of nice and clean often discourages them from spending too much time in those areas. So again, I'd encourage everyone to get out into nature and have the opportunity to see these animals for themselves. And it is really important to make sure that if you do decide to do that, that we ensure that we are being responsible and not impacting our native habitats and our native animals. And so, you know, there's that great phrase, take only photos, leave only footprints, making sure that we're not removing anything from the habitat or destroying or destructing the habitat in any way, making sure we're not leaving garbage behind, making sure that we're not flipping logs or rocks to look underneath them, because that damages very sensitive habitat that different species are using. Again, we do have various numbers of threatened animals that are protected by law, so they can't be disturbed, they can't be picked up and held, as well as if you can't identify a species, it is obviously much safer not to disturb it. And if you are out and about looking for animals, maybe you're taking photos of animals, typically it's good practice not to share exact locations of animals. Like I was mentioning, some species like our wood turtles and our spotted turtles are subject for poaching. And so sometimes by posting a photo on the internet of a really cute turtle that you found could be a flag for somebody to go to that same area and potentially collect them for the pet trade, which is something that our species can't handle very well. So we have reptiles in Canada, and that might sound a little bit strange because when we think about reptiles, we usually think about deserts, we think about tropical areas, and it's cold in Canada. We have very long winters, and snakes and other reptiles, they don't migrate. And so we've seen a lot of different pictures of different reptiles during this presentation, and you might notice a couple features that they tend to share in common with one another. And one is overall, they tend to have pretty small body sizes. Like I was mentioning, we don't have any boas or pythons, none of these massive anacondas here in Canada. And that's because small bodies warm up a lot faster than big bodies. If we had large, massive snakes like a big giant python, it just takes way too long for their bodies to heat up to sufficient temperature. So they would have a very hard time being active and being able to forage and find food during many of our spring and summer months. We also have many of our snake species have a fairly dark body color, like this gray rat snake right here, which anybody who sat in a black car on a hot day or maybe worn a dark sweater on a nice sunny day knows how that dark color absorbs sun much more effectively than a light color. And most of our animals are active during the daytime. We do definitely have some more nocturnal species, but many of our species will be taking advantage of the warmer temperatures during the day. Unlike many desert and tropical species where it's so hot during the daytime, they're actually a lot more active at night. And then, of course, they have to find a spot to survive the winter itself. So they often have to find specialized areas, which we call hibernaculums, areas that don't flood and that are below the frost line, so they can survive those winter months without their bodies and their tissue freezing. The garter snake, again, our most common species, is a pretty special species. It is the species found further north than any other Canadian reptile and second only to the European adder over in Europe, and will sometimes even be seen out and about in areas where there's snow. And I believe actually I saw a photo from one of the land trust areas where a garter snake was spotted in January this year, which wasn't exactly the warmest weather, but it was a little bit warmer than the time around it. And so that animal was able to come out briefly before going back under winter. And so these garter snakes can do that for a couple different reasons. One, they have an enzyme in their blood that resists freezing. So they're able to actually withstand temperatures to about -4 degrees Celsius for a couple days at a time without actually freezing, and which would cause death in a reptile. But most of it is all about avoiding freezing through finding those appropriate hibernaculum sites. And so what is threatening our animals? And I do apologize, there are a couple animals that are deceased here on this slide, but our roads are a massive, massive impact to our animals. We have some, our very threatened gray rat snake here that was unfortunately hit by a car. And these roadways are a massive threat. And so, of course, there are definitely different ways that you can help with this. One is just being really conscious when you're in areas where reptiles are, watching the roads when you're driving, trying to avoid hitting any wildlife that is crossing the roads. A lot of communities are trying to create different pathways for these animals, and not just reptiles, but other species as well, to be able to safely travel under or over roads. So definitely providing your support for those type of initiatives to help those wildlife crossings is really, really important. And then we do have a x-ray here of 2 different snapping turtles, and you might notice a pretty obvious little structure inside of these animals, and that is a fishing hook, with the one here on the left, which you might actually be able to very faintly see that she's actually a female carrying a bunch of eggs as one, and then the one on the right has 2 different fishing hooks inside. Again, these turtles are pretty smart. They often know common fishing areas. They'll come up, they'll try and steal fish off of hooks, and if they get the hook themselves, that can be incredibly damaging to them. And so definitely being very cautious when fishing, trying to avoid the snapping turtle from grabbing onto the hook. And if they do, it is very difficult to remove it, but you can also contact your local wildlife center, who can put you in touch with one of the centers that can help turtles and hopefully be able to remove that hook from them. One that people don't always think about all the time is what we call subsidized predators. And so a subsidized predator is basically any species that thrives thanks to humans. That's animals like raccoons, foxes, really any sort of predator that would be, a possum would be another one, that love to hang around human habitat and eat our garbage and take the spoils of everything that we leave behind. And so obviously we have a lot of these animals in our urban areas, but we're also spending more and more time at cottages and areas away from the city as well. And as we do use those areas and we leave behind things like garbage and food in those areas as well, that encourages these populations of predators. And although they're important parts of the ecosystem as well, when they're in too high of a volume, they have to eat. And so some of what they eat are going to be our other native species, especially juvenile animals and eggs. And this can be incredibly detrimental to our turtle species, especially because turtles grow very, very slow and take a long time to mature and reproduce. So losing eggs, losing babies is very detrimental to our population. So there's a couple other things that you can do personally to try and help our native species, and everyone has heard of, and I'm sure practices reduce, reuse, and recycle, especially those first 2. If we can avoid having to recycle things in the first place, that keeps them out of the waste stream, to use less and to reuse items. You know, if you're buying a new piece of furniture or something for your home, consider maybe purchasing something that's been secondhand used that you get off a Kijiji or from a thrift store, instead of buying something that's brand new. when you do buy brand new, try and find things that have been made with sustainable materials. And recycling, it's a lot harder than we often give it credit for, making sure that we're properly sorting our recycling, cleaning it, making sure that we separate different materials from each other. So for example, if you have a pop bottle, there's two different types of plastic typically. There's usually a colored lid, which is one type of plastic, and then there's the clear bottle part. And so it's important not to just throw the whole bottle, lid and all, into the recycling, but to actually take the lid off, because those are two different materials. So knowing what gets recycled in your municipality is really important to make sure that you're doing it properly and it gets recycled instead of being sent to waste. There are tons of different organizations throughout Ontario that are committed to helping native species, reptiles included. A lot of different rescue organizations and organizations doing surveys and head starting, and they can often use extra hand. Obviously, donations to those sort of organizations are typically always welcome, but not everyone is able to donate either money or their time to different organizations. So one of the things you can also consider doing is supporting by going and attending different events, going to your local conservation parks and participating in those programs that they're doing, as well as zoological facilities. Many zoos are doing some fantastic work, like Toronto Zoo's Adopt a Pond program, for example. So by visiting those facilities, you're actually helping to fund and support those programs from those organizations that are doing great things for our native species. And of course, the more you can let other people know, share the benefits of what reptiles are doing in our ecosystem and why they should be here with us, as well as some of the things that people can do to help. The more people that know these things, the more that we can work together to preserve these animals and have them for many generations to come. And that's really it for me, guys. So that is sort of our talk about Ontario reptiles today, but we are going to be sticking around for a while still and answering any questions that anybody might have.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. That was a great presentation, really informative. You really covered all the bases there. I learned a lot from you. Yeah, so we have a question period now. I guess we have till 8:30. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat, and I will tell them to Cheryl so she can answer them. I guess to get us started, I have a few questions myself, Cheryl. Is it true that incubation temperature can actually affect the sex of turtle offspring?
Yeah, you bet. So it does very much depend on the species of reptile, but turtles are a group where they have what we call temperature dependent sex determination, same as crocodilians and a number of species of lizards have that same mechanic. And it's very different depending on the species. Sometimes if the temperature is warmer, you might get more females. Sometimes it's if it's cooler, it's more females. But typically, regardless of the species, in most cases, if there's sort of a median temperature, you typically get a more even mix of both males and females. And this is definitely an important concern when it comes to conservation, because we're talking about things like climate change and changes in seasonal temperatures. And that could most certainly affect our species in the future if we're suddenly getting skewed sex ratios.
Interesting. Do you know if regarding snakes, are there any projects going on to try to reintroduce the Massasauga rattlesnake in their historic range?
Yes, so there are a few different programs. There's definitely some work being done in the Ojibwe Plains specifically. I don't think there's any reproduction or programs that I know of that are looking at other areas of where these animals have been historically, but definitely in the Ojibwe Plains. A lot of that is still in the early research stages because we're just finding out so many different things. We're talking about how these snakes need hibernaculum hibernaculum sites to overwinter. And it turns out that this is something somewhat cultural, that adult snakes are actually passing this information down to younger generation of snakes. The babies are often following pheromone scent trails left by the adults to find these ideal hibernaculum sites. And if there is no trail to follow, then the babies have a very hard time finding these sites. And in some cases, actually in the Ojibwe Plains, because the Massasauga population essentially disappeared, other species of snakes, like the fox snake, actually moved into the historic Massasauga hibernaculums. And these hibernaculum sites are super, super important. They can't just be everywhere and anywhere. There's these very specific sites that the snakes use.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. That's really cool. So like with the hibernaculums, different species of snakes they don't kind of commingle, or can they? Like would fox snakes and Massasaugas overwinter in the same hibernaculum, or are they kind of territorial with that?
It really seems to depend. There's definitely cases of multiple snake species overwintering together. There's quite a few famous sites in the northern US where rattlesnakes and garter snakes and some other species will overwinter together in the same dens, but not always. And that did seem to be a problem specifically for trying to reintroduce Massasaugas into the Ojibwe Plains, as they would not use the same hibernaculum sites as the fox snakes were using.
Very interesting.
Also have a couple of questions. Oh, sorry, Dan. Do you have?
Yeah, no, I was just going to turn it out to anyone else that has questions now. So that's perfect.
I was wondering what advice you have for properly removing, say, a turtle from the roadside. Should you kind of move it in the direction that it's going, or should you like walk it far into the bush, or?
Yeah. That's definitely an excellent question that, I definitely meant to cover, and then things happened and we missed it. But yes, definitely. So again, it's a way that you can actively help turtles, is if you see them on the road, to be able to move them across the road safely. And Emily, you pointed out probably the most important thing of all, which is making sure that you take them in the direction that they're headed. Sometimes I believe it can be mistaken where they are just brought back to the closest side of the road, even though that might be the opposite way of where they were intending to go to. But typically, if a turtle's crossing the road, it has a destination in mind. It's going in that direction for a reason. So we take them and place them backwards, then they have to cross that whole road all over again. So definitely taking it in the direction. You don't have to go too much further. Again, they're headed in that direction. They're typically going to continue heading in that direction. So basically just placing them on the other side is fine. Most of our turtles are also very easy and very safe to pick up without major concern, basically pretending that they're a sandwich or a hamburger and just holding them firmly on either side of their shell. The snapping turtle, on the other hand, again, they have a very big, long, flexible neck, and they do have a very strong bite. In some cases, they can be quite large and quite heavy. So a little bit more care does have to be taken to move them safely across the road. Typically, one of the easier methods to use that keeps you as safe as possible is to take something like a car mat or a carpet or something else that you might have in your car, and put that underneath the turtle and just drag them across the road that way. That stops you from potentially lifting or dropping a larger specimen, or getting too close to that beak. Anytime we're working with the snapping turtles, we always like to approach them from behind, grabbing the back of their shell and pulling them onto that carpet or that car mat, or in those cases of the smaller one, if we are lifting them, working again at the very, very back of their shell to stay well far away from that beak region. And the snapping turtle is probably one of the easiest turtles to identify from all of our other turtles, mostly because of their really, really, really long tail in comparison to our other turtle species. Even when the snapping turtle itself is a very small baby, they still have a relatively long tail, usually as much as half of their overall body length, where most of our other turtle species are going to have pretty teeny tiny stubby tails. That's one of the easiest sort of defining features between them and some of our other species. Our other species, again, if they are approached and picked up, they still might attempt to bite. So it is really important to avoid putting fingers very close to their face, because that might be their only option that they perceive, their only defense is to be able to do that. And then about moving turtles, another thing, sometimes people are trying to help them. The nests might be placed in some fairly strange looking places. People might not be aware of a local wetland or a pond somewhere nearby that female traveled from. So we do often get phone calls of that nature, of somebody who's found a baby turtle and they're very concerned that it's far away from water and it has no potential habitat to go to. One thing that's really important to know is that if you remove a turtle from its habitat, it might not be able to be released back, especially if the exact location is not known, or if it's potentially been exposed to different pathogens, maybe by some pet reptiles that are at home. So sometimes trying to do a good thing can actually have a negative impact on the animal. The mother has usually laid that nest in that spot for a reason, and she has obviously come from a water source to do that. So even if you don't necessarily see a water source close by, there almost always is. And typically the best thing to do is to just leave those turtles to find their way back. If you have a major concern, such as maybe that area has become a construction site in recent years, then it's best to contact a place like the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and they can help instruct you or potentially send somebody out to be able to look at removing or moving those animals.
Yeah, that's some great advice. I never thought to use the car mat. That would be a really great technique to kind of scoot them off the road.
Mm.
I was going to also say I can live by experience that you can indeed step on a snapping turtle in the middle of a pond and they don't snap at you. It's scary, but they won't do it. At least not in my experience, but yeah. Okay, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to ask now. If you don't, thank you again for attending tonight's webinar. Cheryl, Emily, and I will stay online until about 8:30. If anyone wants to stick around to ask a few additional questions. If not, thanks again, everyone, for attending tonight, and we hope to see you at the next event.
I do have another question.
Sure.
I think you just kind of touched on this. I'm not sure if I missed it, but what actually causes the rattle in the rattlesnake?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because, you know, there's a lot of questions there. Is there something inside? What exactly is going on?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, if you remember that photo of the button, when the new piece comes, it actually surrounds that piece and they kind of fit on top of each other. And basically when they shake it back and forth, all that's making the noise is just those pieces of the rattle hitting each other. It's kind of very similar to if you were to take your hand and just rustle it around in some dry leaves and the noise that the leaves make as they hit each other. That's basically the same mechanic.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know if there was something inside of it, you know, shaking around. So that's really cool.
Do you is there, like, I was hearing the other day about introduced potentially like viruses or funguses that are affecting snakes now? Is that becoming a widespread problem, or?
Yeah, so it's definitely it's been coming further and further up north. It was something that we were seeing initially more in the US, but there's definitely been confirmed cases of things like snake fungal disease in Canada as well now. And so it's something definitely really important for anybody doing field work with the animals. There's protocols to follow as far as making sure to disinfect any equipment, and obviously wearing appropriate PPE and the like to avoid spreading it from site to site.
Well, thanks again, Cheryl. And hopefully we can connect again in the future. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.